Now, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Sudan's government says the Rapid Support Forces paramilitary group has killed at least 2,000 people in the 3 days since it seized control of the city of al-Fasher in North Darfur. This comes as the World Health Organization says it's appalled by reports that 460 patients and their companions were slaughtered at the Saudi maternity hospital in al-Fasher. On Wednesday, UN Refugee Agency official Jacqueline Wilma Parlavliet said tens of thousands of displaced people have been arriving at Tawila, a refuge for civilians fleeing the violence. They describe widespread ethnically and politically motivated killings and indiscriminate attacks, particularly affecting the most vulnerable.
We have accounts of people with disabilities who were executed, who were killed as they were unable to flee. But we also hear people that are trying to leave the city and manage to get out of the city, but on the way they're caught up and they are also being shot.
In Gaza, Israel's military launched several airstrikes on the southern city of Khan Yunis this morning, even after it announced a resumption of the ceasefire. The bombings followed a wave of Israeli attacks a day earlier that killed at least 104 civilians, including 46 children. On Wednesday, friends and neighbors held a funeral procession through Nuseirat for the Abu Dalal family, killed by an Israeli strike on their home.
9 people from the Abu Dalal family and the house next to us were completely wiped out. Not a single person survived. They pulled them out, all as remains from under the rubble, remains. They would bring a piece of the body and say, this belongs to so-and-so. Bring a hand and say, this belongs to so-and-so. It was a very difficult process.
Meanwhile, Israeli forces have intensified raids across the occupied West Bank, storming villages near Jenin and Ramallah. Separately, Israeli settlers stormed a Bedouin village east of Jerusalem, destroying Palestinian property and blocking roads. In another incident, Israeli settlers cut down hundreds of olive trees near Nablus. The settler attacks came as Israeli authorities said they would deport 2 Jewish women who recently joined Palestinians harvesting olives. In a statement, the group Rabbis for Human Rights said, quote, the decision to deport these volunteers reflects an alarming trend of silencing nonviolent human rights work and Jewish voices for justice in Israel-Palestine, unquote. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said Wednesday the Pentagon had bombed another alleged drug trafficking boat in international waters in the Eastern Pacific, killing 4 people. In a social media post, Hegseth wrote, quote, the Western Hemisphere is no longer a safe haven for narco-terrorists bringing drugs to our shores to poison Americans, unquote. He provided no evidence supporting his claims there were drugs aboard the vessel. This comes as CNN is reporting the Trump administration pushed 3-star General Joe McGee out of his role on the Pentagon's Joint Staff following months of tensions with Secretary Hegseth on issues ranging from Russia and Ukraine to the extrajudicial killings in the Caribbean. President Trump says he's agreed to a 1-year trade truce with China that includes the rollback of some tariffs following face-to-face talks in South Korea with Chinese President Xi Jinping. As part of the deal, Beijing agreed to postpone export controls on rare earth minerals and said it would crack down on fentanyl trafficking. China also agreed to resume buying American-made soybeans. We'll have more on the Trump-Xi summit later in the broadcast. President Trump says he's instructed the Pentagon to begin testing nuclear weapons for the first time in 33 years. Citing China and Russia, Trump wrote on his Truth Social platform, quote, because of other countries' testing programs, I've instructed the Department of War to start testing our nuclear weapons on an equal basis, unquote. It is unclear what he was referring to. Russia and China have not tested a nuclear weapon in decades. North Korea tested a nuclear weapon more than 8 years ago. The U.S. conducted its last nuclear test back in 1992, soon after President George H.W. Bush announced a moratorium on nuclear weapons testing. After headlines, we'll have more on the story. Hurricane Melissa is bearing down on Bermuda after leaving a trail of destruction across the Caribbean, with at least 34 confirmed dead, most of them in Haiti. Jamaica's confirmed at least 8 deaths after Melissa made landfall Tuesday as one of the most powerful Atlantic hurricanes on record. This is Sasha Hamilton, a resident of the hard-hit Catherine Hall neighborhood of Montego Bay in Jamaica.
Yesterday was absolutely catastrophic and life-threatening. We were totally inundated. The entire ground floors of all the houses in Catherine Hall and West Green have been flooded. Major asset loss to vehicles, furnitures. We had to do rescue, and we are literally desperate for some help at this point.
According to AccuWeather, Hurricane Melissa could cost Jamaica $22 billion in damages and economic losses, more than Jamaica's annual gross domestic product. Rebuilding could take more than a decade. The United Nations General Assembly has condemned the U.S. embargo on Cuba for the 33rd consecutive year. On Wednesday, 165 countries voted in favor of a non-binding resolution calling on the U.S. to lift the embargo, while 7 nations, including the U.S., Ukraine, and Israel, voted against it. This is Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez.
The blockade is collective punishment as an act of genocide which flagrantly, massively, and systematically violates the human rights of Cubans. It doesn't distinguish between social sectors or economic actors. If the United States government had the smallest concern with helping the Cuban people, as they say, suspend or make humanitarian exceptions to the blockade, given the damage it will cause, just like Hurricane Melissa is causing.
Wednesday's vote came as the hurricane struck eastern Cuba, causing major damage but no deaths after more than 700,000 people were evacuated. Later in the broadcast, we'll get an update from reporter Liva Hernandez, who's on the ground in Santiago de Cuba. The U.S. federal government shutdown has entered its 30th day. On Wednesday, Senate Majority Leader John Thune blocked a bid by Senate Democrats to fund food assistance through the shutdown after the Trump administration refused to draw from a $5 billion contingency fund to maintain SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Without federal funding, some 42 million people who rely on SNAP could lose benefits beginning on Saturday. A congressional candidate in Illinois' 9th District has been indicted in federal charges by the Department of Justice. Democrat Kat Abou-Gazela faces 1 count of conspiracy and 1 charge alleging she, quote, forcibly impeded, intimidated, and interfered, unquote, with an ICE officer. She's been frequently protesting outside the ICE facility in Broadview, Illinois. Soon after indictment, she posted this video on social media.
As I and others have exercised our First Amendment rights, ICE has hit, dragged, thrown, shot with pepper balls, and tear gassed hundreds of protesters, simply because we had the gall to say that masked men coming into our communities, abducting our neighbors, and terrorizing us cannot be our new normal. And because Chicago doesn't back down from bullies in masks who tear gas our neighborhoods, this administration has resorted to weaponizing the federal justice system to scare us into silence. But we're not going to be silent.
To see our interview with Kat Abou-Gazela, go to democracynow.org. The Department of Justice has suspended 2 federal prosecutors after they referred in court documents to the January 6th insurrection as being carried out by a mob of rioters. The prosecutors, Carlos Valdivia and Samuel White, had filed a sentencing memo against January 6 rioter Taylor Taranto, who was pardoned by President Trump on the first day of his 2nd term in office. The 2 prosecutors were seeking 27 months in prison for Taranto for bringing guns and illegal ammunition to President Barack Obama's home in 2023 after Trump posted Obama's Washington address on social media. By Wednesday afternoon, the sentencing document was removed and replaced with another document without references to January 6th, Trump's social media post, and the 2 prosecutors. A jury in Illinois convicted Sean Grayson, a sheriff's deputy, of 2nd-degree murder in the 2024 shooting death of Sonia Massey, a black mother of 2, who had called 911 herself about a suspected prowler. Grayson was originally charged with first-degree murder, but the jury opted to convict him on a lesser charge. That prompted anger from Massey's supporters, including her father, James Wilburn.
a difference in this country when you have my skin color and Grayson's skin color. We need serious justice, not a miscarriage of justice that happened here in Peoria. We need to pass the George Floyd Policing Act. We need to pass the John Lewis Voting Act. Yes. We need to make the Sonia Massey law across the whole United States. Yes. Then no family in our country can go through what our family has gone through.
In July 2024, Sean Grayson, another deputy, arrived at Massey's house after she reported suspicious activity. Grayson then shot Massey after he confronted her about handling a pot of...
We begin today's show looking at U.S.-China relations and President Trump's threat to resume nuclear weapons testing. President Trump and President Xi Jinping met in South Korea and agreed to a one-year trade truce. But the trade deal was overshadowed by Trump's announcement that the U.S. would resume testing nuclear weapons for the first time since 1992. Just before his meeting with Xi, Trump wrote on Truth Social, quote, because of other...
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. The right's secret plan to help billionaires buy elections. That's the headline of a recent article by our next guest, David Sirota, editor-in-chief of The Lever. In the article, David writes about how two upcoming Supreme Court cases could turn the country into what he calls a kleptocracy. The article's based on Sirota's new book, Master Plan, The Hidden Plot to Legalize Corruption in America. David's also has a new piece in The Nation on the New York mayoral race, The Real Lesson from Zohran Mamdani's Ascent. David Sirota, welcome back to Democracy Now! Why don't you start off by talking about how you define the master plan? We talked to you when you did the series of podcasts on it, The Hidden Plot to Legalize Corruption in America.
So we're immersed in corruption. You see it in the headlines every day. And I think there's this perception that this is a natural course of events in the sense of it's a force of nature. But what we unearth in the book, for the first time really ever, is the secret plan to make this kind of corruption that we're immersed in legal. A plan hatched in the early 1970s to begin deregulating the campaign finance system and narrowing and making essentially unenforceable the anti-bribery laws in America. It started with the Powell memo. There was a lot of organizing. This memo written by a soon-to-be Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell, who urged a corporate investment and an oligarch investment in politics and media because he was afraid, and corporate America was afraid, of the rising tide of consumer protection laws and the like. And that out of that movement in the early 1970s came the movement to create court rulings and legal precedents equating money in politics, not with corruption, but with constitutionally protected speech, giving corporations those constitutional rights to spend in elections and buy elections, ultimately culminating in Citizens United. Meanwhile, a series of court rulings starting in the mid-2010s to overturn corruption convictions, to narrow the definition of bribery, leading up to now, as you alluded to in the intro, two cases at the Supreme Court, one spearheaded by Vice President J.D. Vance, to eliminate what was left of campaign finance restrictions after Citizens United, and to further reduce the definition of bribery to make essentially quid pro quo transactions in politics legal. This is all part of a plan by a corporate movement that sees democracy, the government providing what people want, sees that as a threat and wants to turn the democracy from a one vote kind of democracy into a $1 kind of democracy where money is the decider.
But David, why do you call it a secret plan if it's basically a class or a group of people within a class clearly operating in their own interests?
That's certainly true. What we uncover in the book is from the Powell memo, this memo written by Lewis Powell, came never before revealed a series of meetings and task forces by the country's most powerful people. We're talking about executives at major media companies and Fortune 500 companies forming a task force to implement the Powell memo's demands that corporations invest in and essentially take over American politics. What you saw in the 1970s into the 80s and 90s was the implementation of what the Powell memo had called for. And it was not revealed. It was much of it was done in secret. We're talking about investments in motion pictures. We're talking about investments in media entities. We're talking about strategizing for how to implement and put loopholes into campaign finance laws. One of the first meetings that came out of the Powell memo, let me give you one example, was a meeting at Disney World, where they flew in Gerald Ford, who was soon to be the president, at a time when anti-corruption laws were moving through Congress after Watergate, and they ended up slipping in a loophole into that original campaign finance bill, which created the corporate PAC for the first time. And of course, from there, we get the rulings that I've just mentioned.
You also talk about the Mamdani campaign and
of rulings. This is, if people remember, the Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell corruption case where he was convicted them and to reduce those bribery laws because reducing those bribery laws and deregulating the campaign finance system essentially reduces the power of people. It rigs the democracy. How can Trump be held accountable if the highest court in the land essentially says that bribery is no longer a crime?
And David, could you talk about the intimidation, the changes?
There are now enough elected votes in Congress to release the Epstein files. And basically, when the shutdown is over, under the current newly elected membership of Congress, there should be the 218 votes to override the Republican opposition and actually release new Epstein files. So that is a big headline. I'm going to get into that in this breakdown. I'm Ari Melber, the MSNBC anchor, chief legal correspondent. I'm also going to talk about, in this breakdown, this hat, which Steve Bannon sent me, and speaks to one of the big problems we have in America, where you have politicians openly talking about trying to end democracy as we know it. So I'm going to get to that in this breakdown. But we begin with the Epstein files, and we actually are at a turning point which, but for the government shutdown, would mean that we have now the votes in Congress to see the rest of what DOJ under Donald Trump is hiding about Epstein. That's a major development. There are basically very few ways in Congress to get something for a floor vote without having leadership wanting it. That's just how the congressional rules have always worked in the modern era. And so the Republicans under Speaker Johnson have gone along with Donald Trump to hide any new release of Epstein files, material from the case, material that could be meaningful and important for the public to know, or even raise questions about how he died, what other avenues and leads were not pursued. And so that's usually where these things stop, and the Republicans, backed by Johnson, have tried to stop things there. But there are now 218 elected votes to release the Epstein files. What does that mean? It means that there's a discharge petition, there's a lot of congressional language about it, and basically because of this new special election, there has been a new member of Congress elected that's going to join.
Well, put your seatbelt on. Get yourself in a booster seat, because this is going to be a bumpy ride. Welcome, everybody, to the show. This is a big one. Let's start with this story. The GOP House Oversight Committee is doing an investigation into Biden's cognitive. And the whole thing seems kind of silly to me, because it's like, what are we going to get to the bottom of? His brain was old and it kept getting older. And then we started hearing stuff like,
you're the sucker. You're the loser.
So it's obviously just sort of a stunt. And it's funny because they called the House investigation into January 6th, where there really was stuff to get to the bottom of. Who was involved? What was Trump's participation? What was his responsibility, etc.? And they were like, this is a total scam. Why are we doing this? Trump's out of office. Biden, who's definitely not going to run again, we're doing a big investigation. Okay, well, one of Biden's aides who was giving his testimony had a really interesting way of responding to one of the questions, which I thought was fascinating, which was to drop an Epstein bomb, which I think for Democrats just might even separate it from the morality or the motivation you'd feel based on the circumstances we're in. Just strategically, I think this is key. Bring it back to that until Trump actually releases everything. And the question that was asked was of Andrew Bates, who was a top Biden aide, was, did you ever threaten journalists, or did the Biden administration ever threaten journalists to lose, that they would lose access because of something? And Andrew Bates goes, oh, that's interesting because Trump, well, actually, I'm spoiling it. Just watch. While you do, please do click the subscribe button. If you appreciate this show, there's only one like it. That's what I hear.
Have you ever threatened a journalist or an editor with future access to admin officials?
Like the AP, maybe?
I'm sorry?
Like the AP, maybe? Sorry, go ahead.
Would you like an interview, Counselor? We can
No,
bring it back.
you could talk to your colleagues about the AP, the press pool, but go ahead.
So that's the lawyer. And the lawyer goes, like the Associated Press, which is what the Trump administration did, cutting off the Associated Press's access because they wouldn't call it the Gulf of America, because they wanted people who read their paper to know what they were talking about. And then the Trump administration went very nuclear, not literally. And then it gets to this Epstein part.
I do think that is a fair point when the current president is suing the Wall Street Journal.
I'm asking about you, sir.
No, I know. But I think that if the current president is suing the Wall Street Journal for outing elements of his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein.
You may not like his answer, but let him finish.
I would ask that he answer my question.
Finish your answer.
The current president is suing the Wall Street Journal because they detailed that he wrote a disgusting letter to Jeffrey Epstein that said, may every day be another beautiful secret. And I do not think that anything...
I think it was a wonderful secret, Andrew. Okay. Would you like to revise? Do you still think it's disgusting? A wonderful secret?
Anything I've ever done in my life could come remotely close to how unethical that is.
Okay, now I would like you to answer my original question, which was, have you ever threatened a journalist or editor with future access, or pulling back future access to admin officials?
The only thing that occurs to me is if someone had demonstrated a pattern of hiding relevant facts or of being over the top in their negativity to the degree that we did not trust them to be fair about their representation of people, we could then consider being less liberal in the way that we granted interviews, but that would have to be based on a very significant set of events. And I would not consider that to be a threat. I would consider that to be a reasonable caution about, hey, you left out.
Andrew, I liked the Epstein part. That was a good thing to drop. It's not a threat, a reasonable caution. I like that. It's like, I was half expecting him to go, it's not a threat. It was a promise.
A really important thing that our top person for whatever issue said, and that fundamentally changed the meaning. So how could we trust that if we do this kind of thing again, there won't be that kind of distortion?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know what the question's really getting at. Was it, because it's supposed to be about Biden's mental acuity, was it that they would punish journalists who reported on it? Maybe that's what the question's getting at. So then journalists wouldn't want to report on it, even though, hey, I'm old enough to remember all of the journalists who were reporting on it and still had a bunch of access. Every 3 days, there was a panel on how old's Biden. Look, how do you think if it weren't being reported on, if there was such a successful cover-up, the vibe was strange. Podcast listeners, get ready, because he's going to be quiet for so long. Like longer pauses than Alex Jones does when he goes, the deep state. Right. So just get ready for that. The show did not end. There will just be a lot of silence. And he's being asked, was your pay structure connected at all to Biden staying in the race or Biden winning re-election?
If I brought the House back and we passed another CR, it would meet the exact same fate from Chuck Schumer. He would mock it, they would spike it, and they would try to blame it on us. So what would be the point of that?
Speaker Mike Johnson putting a damper on the idea of bringing House lawmakers back before the Senate acts on a government funding bill, telling reporters it would be a futile exercise.
Besides, they'd have to swear in somebody that got elected how long ago?
A long time ago.
A month ago.
Yeah,
And then they'd have to...
The defining vote on the Epstein files. Wouldn't want that.
Epstein files released. Why, that would just be futile if you wanted to keep all that out of
so
Americans' hands.
We'll stop a lot of other things, too, just for that.
Yeah.
All right. There may be some small signs of progress, though. Senate Majority Leader John Thune yesterday said there's been an increase in conversations among rank-and-file senators and that he thinks he'll talk with Democrats, quote, pretty soon. That comes with less than 72 hours until vital SNAP benefits expire for nearly 42 million Americans. Thune and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer have not met at all this month to discuss an exit path, but Schumer told reporters earlier this week he believes after November 1st, Republicans will face, quote, increased pressure to negotiate with us. With us, we have the co-host of our fourth hour, staff writer at The Atlantic, Jonathan Lemire. MSNBC contributor Mike Barnicle is here, and MSNBC senior Capitol Hill reporter Ali Vitale. She's, of course, the host of Way Too Early.
And before we get to the reporting, Mike, it's almost as if over the past several days, Republicans have figured out that Medicaid cuts impact red states as much or more than they impact blue states. Cuts to SNAP benefits make children in Missouri and Georgia, and even though Tommy Tuberville doesn't know it, Alabama, hungry, that the cutting of these benefits are going to hurt their voters as much or more than it's going to hurt Democratic voters. And while I certainly understand the frustration of John Thune on the floor about them passing their clean CRs, this debate's gone well beyond that now, and it is about health care and Republicans who haven't done anything since claiming they're going to have a better Obama
10 years.
care. Yeah, I think, we're moving beyond 10 years. They've done absolutely nothing, proposed absolutely nothing on health care. It's obvious they lose the health care fight, and that's what this debate's about right now.
Well, they have the 10 years of waiting to announce potentially whatever their health plan is supposed to be. 10 years people have been waiting for it. We haven't had it. Now they're facing, obviously, the D-Day of November 1st. November 1st, that's when people go hungry. That's when people can't find enough money in their small allotment of money to buy food, to put food on the table. That's what's scary. John Thune yesterday on the floor of the United States Senate, I was shocked. Given his nature.
John's a mild-mannered guy.
Yes, I was
I love it at the end, the upper Midwestern guy comes up, my Akin back! Yeah. I mean, no, he doesn't. I've known him for over 30 years. I've never heard him raise his voice once.
But don't you think, given his nature, because you do know him, and I was thinking of you when I first saw it on TV yesterday afternoon, don't you think he desperately wants to make a deal? I don't figure out how can they not make a deal. What is the problem?
Well, they're going to have to make a deal, but it doesn't make sense. I mean, again, I've been in the exact position where the government shut down in 1995, 96. We would keep sending appropriation bills to Bill Clinton, and he'd keep vetoing them. And he wanted to prove a point. And sometimes, eventually we started sending him exactly what he asked for, like in legislative branch appropriate. He vetoed it. And we said, but we did exactly what you wanted us to do. And then he'd go out and go, Republicans are cutting Medicare to pay for tax cuts for the rich. I go, but that's where we are now. So it's very frustrating. And for John Thune, he's thinking, okay, we've put a CR that you voted for last time on the floor 14 times, and yet you're still, you know, voting against it and then complaining about the benefits that we're talking about funding. But again, John, this has moved in large part, I think, because the president has been going across Asia and he's been focused on Middle East peace. He's been focused on not insignificant things. He hasn't really been focused on this, but do you get a sense inside the White House and from your reporting in Washington that Republicans are starting to understand